Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining. My name is Mark Orlando. I'm the field CTO at Push Security. Over the next 30 minutes or so, I want to talk to you about shadow AI. Shadow AI, of course, is a term that has been thrown around quite a bit, especially recently, and often without a lot of context or precision in terms of what this means. My goal today is to give you a clear, practical way to think about this problem, what it actually is, how it differs from the more traditional shadow IT problem we've been dealing with for many years now. And I'll also talk about how attackers are exploiting this gap in visibility and control and tendency of users to want to adopt all of these cool new toys. And finally, I'll give you a practical roadmap that we can take to gain some measure of control over this rapidly expanding problem. So let's dive in. It's been a pretty noisy year. If you've been reading the headlines at all for the past 18 to 24 months, if you spent any time on the expo floor out at Black Hat, you've probably seen a version of every one of these headlines. AI agents are attempting unsanctioned cyber attacks, or models are breaking free from human control, breaking into companies during security tests or based on directives they've been given. My take on all of this is that some of these headlines describe very real, measurable risk that is likely to land on your desk if you're a defender or you're a CISO. Others, I would say, are more lab experiments or speculative research, or frankly, just failures in basic security controls, network segmentation, those kinds of things. And the problem is, of course, that these tend to get all lumped together as one problem or parts of the same problem. And that makes it very hard for us to know, as practitioners, as security leaders, where to spend our limited time and budget. So the first thing I want to do here is separate the signal from the noise. Because of course, if we try to defend against all things at all times and all places, we know that we're probably not going to do a great job. So let's get a little bit more specific. Let's focus on things that we can actually control, and less on things that would fall into that kind of hype cycle, or maybe not even hype, but concerns for another day, for maybe a little bit further out. So if we split this world into two different columns, on the left are the things that dominate the headlines: AI escaping the lab, autonomous cyber weapons, traveling back through time to kill someone that they're going to fight a battle with later, deep fakes, those kinds of things, right? Genuine long-term concerns, except maybe the killer robots going back through time, although I'm not ruling it out. But we have to be honest about our span of control today in the enterprise. Right? You as a security leader, probably not going to solve model alignment, probably not going to redirect the research that a frontier lab is doing. Those things are mostly out of your hands. On the right are things that maybe we actually can control, right? Things that actually impact us right now, today, right? How employees are using AI apps, what apps they're granting access to, how they're accessing those apps, what data they're sharing. Okay, that is a controllable, solvable problem. Everything I talk about for the rest of this session lives more or less in that right-hand column, because I think that's where we can have the biggest impact. So let's kind of narrow this down even one more level, right? And let's pull out an industry favorite, the iceberg diagram. We think about the kind of most visible, or maybe most talked about, I won't say hyped, maybe hyped problems. That top 10%, this is securing agentic AI use, right? Autonomous agents that are acting on our behalf. Monitoring and controlling that activity, protecting them from injection attacks, those types of things. That's very important. That risk is growing and expanding quickly. But for today, for most organizations, that is maybe 10% of the real production risk. The other 90%, those things below the waterline, so to speak, involve securing human use of AI. So what apps are being used, how they're being accessed, those types of things that I just mentioned. Right? This is relatively unglamorous work. It can be very difficult, but that's where we're going to spend our time. When agents become a bigger part of our risk, and they most assuredly will, the same kind of visibility and control foundation we're going to talk about today will carry right over into that set of solutions. But don't let the hype pull your attention away from the 90%, the things that are really hurting you today, towards the 10% of most hyped issues. So there are three concepts I want to introduce here, and these things are tightly woven together. starting with governance, right? Governance is your paper. That's your acceptable use policies, your risk framework for evaluating new tools. AI visibility is knowing what AI apps are in use across the organization, right? So that's ground truth. Now, AI control is enforcing your governance across those apps based on your visibility and in line with your policies, right? That's your enforcement mechanism. That's your muscle. You can think of these as part of a three-legged stool, right? Without any one of these or two of these, the model no longer works, it falls over. So if we want to start to exert some control over shadow AI, we need all three of these things. So hold on to that, because when we get to solutions, this is the test I will use to evaluate everything else against all the potential kind of controls for this. So a really common question that I get from security teams and CISOs is, hey, when you say shadow AI, that sounds really interesting, but isn't that really just shadow IT with, a disguise, a new coat of paint? I think about the Scooby-Doo meme where it's like shadow AI is like the mask, and then Fred from Scooby-Doo like tears off the mask and it's really just shadow IT underneath. I don't think that's quite accurate. We've been managing unsanctioned SaaS for years now. Why is AI any different? I think it is different, and here's why. In the classic shadow IT world or shadow SaaS, you had a set of apps arranged around this core hub, which is your identity provider. In this example on the slide, it's Entra ID. It could be Google Workspace or whatever your IDP is, right? In the AI world, on the right-hand side, that LLM becomes effectively a hub in its own right, because now it is also wired into all of your major enterprise apps, your Salesforce, your GitHub, your Drive, your Slack, all of it. So that AI functionality is now embedded in all of these corporate tools that you own, all of the data that's in those tools. And in this way, every AI app is functionally kind of a low code or no code automation platform, right? Very powerful, very flexible, but also this changes how apps integrate with each other and how data flows between them. Again, you've got this LLM, which you don't control. You can't always predict. You can't control how people are going to use it necessarily. And it's operating as that kind of central hub. So attackers, they're targeting the functionality of that hub, those apps, the behavior of the apps themselves, the prompts, the connections, the automations. I'm going to offer up some examples of these that we're seeing in the wild, but that is a different kind of problem set. It's a different attack surface than what we were dealing with shadow IT. So your shadow IT playbook probably doesn't cover some of the use cases that we're going to discuss. To make this a little bit more concrete, more actionable, I want to break shadow AI into four main categories. Each one of these has a different risk profile. Each one needs a different type of control. Solving one doesn't necessarily solve the others, but I think this is a really useful mental model for thinking about and breaking down these problems. Category one, we've got shadow AI apps. So these are applications that are either AI native or AI enabled that your users are signing up to and using without your approval, maybe even without your knowledge. Bucket number two, we've got shadow tenants. These are personal accounts on approved tools. So maybe we're using ChatGPT, which is the approved corporate LLM, but we're using a personal account, and a tenant that is not your approved enterprise tenant, maybe has lesser security controls, but certainly you don't have visibility into what's happening there. Category number three, shadow extensions. These are browser extensions, some of which are lookalike extensions, some of which are relatively benign, maybe a little scammy kind of extensions that introduce some sort of AI feature set, but may have very broad permissions, maybe impersonate official tools, but they're installed and used without your knowledge or explicit permission. And the fourth category here are shadow integrations. So these are OAuth and MCP connections between AI tools and corporate systems like Google Workspace, M365, Salesforce, those kinds of things. So hold on to these categories, keep them in mind, because I'm going to show you examples of real world attacks that we've seen at Push Security in each one of these categories. Before I get there, I want to share some of what we're seeing out there across all the environments in which Push is deployed. On average, an organization has about 16 different shadow AI apps in use. We've seen those numbers as high as 40 unique shadow AI apps. Again, that means unapproved, perhaps unknown apps that are either kind of AI native or AI enabled. On the integration side, right, that's 17, as high as 55. On the shadow extension side, right, in the browsers themselves, we see on average 17 unique AI related browser extensions deployed in a given enterprise. We have seen that number go as high as 163 different AI or AI related apps. And 47% of those have sufficient permissions for account takeover. So that is a massive attack surface. And if you've ever tried to get your arms around all the browser extensions deployed in your environment, especially if you've got users with different browsers, or you've got unmanaged browsers, that is a Herculean task. It's very, very difficult. Essentially something that we specialize in. Using some other statistics here, just a few I want to call out. Verizon's DBIR, the latest data breach investigation report, cited this number: 67% of AI use in the enterprise, AI apps in the enterprise, are connected to personal accounts. So these are, AI kind of app accounts that users have stood up as personal accounts. These are not approved, managed corporate tenants, right? 38% of these allow for file uploads, or 38% of file uploads are happening from personal accounts. It's a better way to phrase it. So what all of these numbers tell us is basically that this is a significant and fast growing problem of shadow AI, and that there's at least some evidence, some indication that users are, leveraging personal access and personal accounts to get these capabilities. Maybe, where kind of approved corporate solutions don't exist. We'll talk about that more in a little bit, but I thought interesting to share some of those numbers. So let's get out of the theory. Let's forget about that for a minute. And let me show you what attackers are actually doing. We're going to go category by category, those 4 different buckets that I talked to you about, starting with shadow apps. All right, here's a really great example. And frankly, something that I really love it because I think it is dramatically underreported. I think it's really slick and it's dead simple. Here's how this attack works. An attacker will take out or compromise a Google ad account, and they'll use that access to make sure that their search results are the first results shown when you Google Cloud Code install, Notebook LN install, right? Out there looking for installation materials for your LLM of choice, right? So you can see some examples here. These are real examples of search results with those sponsored results up at the top. If you look really closely, eagle-eyed viewers will see that in a sponsored result for Cloud Code install, that first result is a squarespace.com domain. It is not an Anthropic or Claude domain. So an attacker has stood this up. When you click on it, here is the type of thing you're going to see. We call this install fix because it's a combination of a very convincing looking install doc. You can see the real Cloud Code install page and the fake one. They are pixel perfect reproductions. The only difference is the actual install commands, both of which are curl commands, both of which have long strings after curl, right? Those are very different. In the attacker Cloud Code install document, you have a curl command with some switches and a base64 encoded string, most likely. Once that is pasted in a terminal, that will grab and install and run some kind of info stealer or malware or some other kind of malicious action the attacker is trying to get the user to initiate, right? So it's kind of like a click fix style lure in that way, tricking the user into running something locally in their terminal. But these are all install themed, and there are tons of different examples. I'm going to show you a live one right now. You can see we're doing a Google search for an LLM tool. We're proceeding to the first search result. Maybe I'm not paying close attention. I don't see it's a sponsored result, but hey, it's all the same anyway, right? I click on it and I copy and I paste the command and I off and running. Okay. Only this command, again, base64 encoded. When decoded, you can see the curl command. That is a malicious command of some sort, either installing and running malware, info stealer. Bottom line is, it is not the real install command. In addition to that install fix kind of attack, we've seen another kind of technique that we call LLM share, where attackers essentially use the messaging feature or the chat feature, the shareable chat feature of popular LLMs to capitalize on the legitimate domain of that LLM, but share malicious content. So you can see here where an attacker has redirected a user through a dialogue that says, hey, if you want to install this or you want to access it, we're really busy right now, but hey, you can go ahead and do it. All you have to do is download and install the desktop version of your favorite LLM app here. You can see that's a downloaded executable. In this case, that notification to the user is coming from chatgpt.com. It's going to pass a lot of your reputation checks. But of course, what the user is getting tricked into running, that's where the actual compromise is happening. Okay. So really slick stuff here. The second category that I mentioned are shadow tenants. Okay. This is how attackers trick your users into accessing poison application tenants. Somewhat less well known than phishing, but in some ways, in a lot of ways, it is much nastier. So these are examples or screenshots from a campaign that targeted Push Security not too long ago. We actually wrote about this on our research blog. So here's how this works. The attacker spins up their own, in this case, ChatGPT tenant, and they have made it look like it is a Push Security ChatGPT instance and proceed to blast out invites to Push Security users saying, hey, you've been invited to join the corporate Push Security ChatGPT. An unsuspecting user might see this, click, seems good to me. I'll go ahead and log in. The attacker had already associated a credit card with this account. So it was, for all intents and purposes, an enterprise account, probably a stolen credit card. And upon access, the user just sees the regular ChatGPT. And so they start using it as they would any other corporate tool, maybe sharing sensitive details with it, uploading documents, things like that. Fortunately, in this case, our eagle-eyed staff identified this attack really early on. We were able to jump on it before anyone even accessed this tenant. But really interesting way to, again, capitalize on legitimate domain, legitimate functionality. The only thing that was amiss here is this wasn't actually an approved, legitimate Push Security tenant. So for all of you defenders out there, all you SOC analysts, this would be really tough for you to find, right? Because this is essentially just looks like on the network and on the endpoint, somebody using ChatGPT, especially difficult if ChatGPT happens to be your approved corporate LLM. There are various other post-exploitation techniques attackers might use following something like this. We've enumerated a lot of these in our browser and identity attacks matrix. We talk about a technique called sample jacking, which we wrote about a few years ago, where following access to an attacker controlled tenant, they might do some additional things using a fake of IDP to gather credentials and things like that. But really, really interesting stuff. And the reason I wanted to share this, in addition to this matrix being, I think, a very useful kind of model that extends what you see in MITRE ATT&CK and some of those other frameworks, is that attackers are constantly mixing these things up. And, we've identified these things in the wild, LLM share, install fix. Earlier, it was consent fix. And especially with the rise of AI on the offensive side, attackers are able to spin up these really convincing lures, delivery infrastructure. They're able to, string together these post-exploitation follow-on activities very, very, very easily. So the old method of trying to use network indicators or watch endpoint activity for these things that are happening strictly within the browser context really just aren't the best way to identify this stuff, at least if you want to identify it and stop it at the moment of execution. Okay. In the case of click fix or install fix, maybe your EDR catches it when the user is running that command or when they're installing software or, triggering kind of suspicious looking processes in memory. But that's post-exploitation. It's really not where we want to be. So enough said on that. Getting back to shadow tenants. Okay. We've talked about LLMs, ChatGPT, and so forth, but shadow tenants is a much bigger problem than just whatever enterprise LLM you're using. Look at how many common platforms allow this kind of attack. Me to set up my own tenant and then phish your users or invite your users to join. And depending on what app we're talking about, if an attacker convinces a user that their tenant is the legitimate one, you're looking at some pretty dangerous exposure here. In the case of Zapier or Make, I mean, we're talking about automations, automated scenarios that the victim's building using their Gmail, their Drive, their Salesforce, that the attacker, as an admin for that tenant, has full access to. That is mental. It's crazy. Okay. With GitLab, we're talking about code access. If a victim pushes to a repo that the attacker controls. So we're talking CI/CD pipeline compromise, ChatGPT, Claude, not only visibility for the attacker into all of the prompts, but providing malicious instructions to trick the victim into connecting other business apps. You can see how far this problem goes and how fast it potentially spreads. Now let's talk about the third category of shadow AI risks, shadow extensions. These are fake or maybe kind of scammy or lookalike extensions that users will install into their browsers. We think of these as sleeper extensions or sleeper agents. I think sleeper agent sounds cooler, so I'm going to go with that. But essentially, the danger here is that a user installs something that they think is perfectly benign, that adds AI capabilities to their workflow or whatever project they're doing, whatever work they're doing in the browser. And that browser extension either has malicious capabilities the user isn't aware of, or at some point, once it reaches a certain install base, or maybe the development team changes, an attacker purchases an extension, now they can start introducing and pushing malicious capabilities without the user being any wiser. So here are a couple of screenshots of real examples of AI apps observed in active use, right? Available on browser stores by Push Security. Pretty scammy, definitely misleading. You can see these are attempting to appear as Copilot sidebar, ChatGPT for Gmail. If you take a closer look at the domains associated with these, at the developer points of contact, you can see these have nothing to do with Microsoft or OpenAI or Google. But if you start looking for this stuff, it is everywhere. And these, while maybe misleading, probably aren't malicious yet, but also probably not something that we want employees to install. And again, these are available. Similar things are available on Chrome Web Store, probably reasonable reviewed. You can see our ChatGPT for Gmail has 4.1 out of 5 stars, right? Not bad. Now let's talk about the fourth category, which are shadow extensions. This is where attackers ride OAuth or MCP connections into full-on supply chain compromise. This is the most impactful, I would say the most consequential of the 4 examples. So I'm going to give you a real case study. Does anyone remember a few months ago, feels like a few years ago at this point, the Vercel breach, right? This is a really good one because it's well documented, and I think it's a great example of attacks we've seen in several other organizations as well. So here's what happened. A Vercel user signs up for this AI app called Context AI and connected it to Google Workspace as part of a trial, okay? As I think many of us could see a user doing. Totally normal. Months go by. Then Context AI gets breached by a group, maybe imitating shiny hunters, at least using the same kind of social engineering tactics. The attacker digs around in the environment, finds secrets that grant access to connected customer environments. And so they're able to use that to then pivot into Vercel's connected apps and systems from this trial. The result of that, data stolen, listed for sale online. We're talking source code, database contents, NPM, GitHub tokens, all kinds of bad stuff, right? So one thing that's kind of interesting about this, which is really the kicker, is that this app that was connected was actually a deprecated consumer version of the app, not even meant for enterprise use, no longer available to install. And the reason I think that's worth mentioning is this is a forgotten integration that one person set up, maybe forgot about, certainly at an IT governance level, forgotten about. And that's really shadow integration in a nutshell, something that was installed once, granted some access, seemed pretty low stakes, was promptly forgotten about, and that came back obviously to bite Vercel later. That same OAuth connection pattern was behind the Clue and Antidote supply chain breaches you may have heard about, plenty of other high profile victims. So this is now a standard part of the playbook. This is not some weird, sophisticated one-off. And if you take one thing from this section, it's that the integrations that you approve or your users approve and forget about are as dangerous as the ones you never even knew were there. So really good example. So let's step back and look at what we've talked about here, what we built in our shadow AI of control capability. Remember our hub and spoke model we talked about with these AI apps, these LLMs as kind of the new hub, right? Everything of value wired into these apps that are often less secure than, say, an enterprise cloud platform that we spent a lot of time and made a lot of investments in hardening. So ask yourself a few basic questions about the things that you have at the center of this hub. Is it protected by MFA? Is it personal account or a corporate account being used with that app? Can you stop accounts from joining tenants that aren't yours? Do you know what OAuth scopes have actually been granted? And the one that really matters is if that gets compromised, what does that mean for your apps and your data? If you answer no to any of these questions or to multiple of these questions, we've got some work to do. So that takes us to kind of our last section here, which is so what? What do we do about it? We know it's a big problem. We've talked about it. We've seen some examples. So let's talk about what actually works. And the good news here is that this is a solvable problem as long as you have the right visibility and the right control point. So what you see here is the SAND AI security maturity model. It's a really useful mental model. Huge fan of this. I'm a little biased being on SAND's faculty myself, but if you look at this, we can see kind of the progression of maturity on AI security. Most organizations are in stages 1 or 2, okay? Unaware of the risks or their kind of exposure and maybe largely reactive. And then one of my favorite parts of the model is this chasm, the awareness versus operational capability chasm. And to get across that chasm, a lot of organizations adopt what SANS calls the framework of no, which is essentially that, hey, we're just going to go block all of this stuff outright until we can get a handle on it, until we can put some things in place or come up with a plan around this. And I think what we've seen time and time again, and maybe what we can infer from the DBIR stats and some of the other numbers that I showed you earlier, is that when presented with the framework of no, what are users going to do? They're going to find some ways around your security controls, right? And kind of take advantage of all these cool new toys and the productivity gains that AI can offer. So we're going to talk about how we can avoid the framework of no and how we can actually move smartly through this maturity framework, because blocking as a strategy, historically not awesome. So what works instead? We like to think about this approach as the paved path instead of the barrier. So think about why people are going around your controls in the first place. Based on what we've seen, 80% of unapproved AI apps are, accessed using personal accounts simply because that's easier to do, because there is no corporate path to connect my corporate account to an approved AI tool that I can use. 57% of users do this, right? Use those personal accounts to access AI because the formal process is too slow or it's too cumbersome or maybe doesn't exist. So notice what's not on this list, which is malice against the organization. Users don't do this. They don't adopt these apps or install these extensions or establish these OAuth connections to hurt the organization. They're just trying to get their work done. So we need to think about the incentives here. Make the governed path easier than the workaround. Okay, we kind of beat this by making the right thing as effortless and as low friction as we can. So what does that look like? Okay, you can be in a few different camps here as far as how restrictive or how lax you are with users adopting these things. But getting visibility is the first step, regardless of where you land on that enforcement spectrum. And visibility means knowing what people are using and how they're using it, how they're accessing it. So how are they authenticating? Are they using SSO? Are they using MFA? Are they trying to hook in unnecessary or unapproved integrations? And then what are they putting into it? Files they're uploading, text they're pasting in. Is that compliant with our policies or not? And if you're using multiple apps, right, those security costs can really add up. I think that this is really similar to the problems that we were talking about, a few years ago with cloud, still talking about to some extent with cloud and the shared responsibility model. So a lot of these vendors, especially OpenAI, Anthropic, Microsoft, Google, kind of the major LLM vendors, they provide a lot of security controls once you achieve a certain tier or a certain level of account. So I think the takeaway from this slide and the point I'm trying to make here is figure out, where it makes sense to leverage native kind of built-in vendor controls and where your gaps remain in visibility and control and those paved paths where you need to introduce some additional controls, right? One of the major issues here with adoption of native vendor controls is in heterogeneous environments where we're not standardized on Microsoft and we're not standardized on just OpenAI or just Anthropic. And as I said, in a multi-AI environment, the costs of these things can really add up. So definitely something that we want to keep in mind. So getting near the end here, this is I think a repeatable path to gaining some of the control that we've been talking about. We want to start by deploying in-browser detection and response and governance via the Push Security extension across the enterprise in all of your browsers. Whenever browser users are using, we want to have that visibility there. We want to see what AI apps people are using, start to get some of that telemetry into our SIM and get full visibility. Then we want to start planning some guardrails. We want to start establishing that paved path. We want to start thinking about active controls, whether that's clipboard controls for secrets or PII, building policies we can apply per group or per user. Think about file upload blocking for sensitive content. Okay, start to establish those guardrails while still allowing users to do what they need to do. And then step 3, we want to start layering in kind of more breadth of shadow AI control. So that means reviewing extension inventory, right? Auditing OAuth integrations, enabling file download blocking for unapproved tools. We start to tighten things down once we have that paved path in place. And then step 4, we start to build towards a fully compliant, more mature posture. Okay, we look at custom content patterns for clipboard activity, things that we've seen our users, doing and sharing in those prompts or in those pastes into prompts that we don't want them doing. Maybe some custom file upload rules or detection rules for specific document types, detections for specific OAuth or MCP connections. And again, once we've established that approved method, the approved tool set, the approved tenant and login method, then we start restricting everything else, or at least instrumenting those unapproved methods and unapproved apps. So here is our kind of 4-quadrant or 4-bucket model. Once again, gaining AI visibility control with push security. You can see now in terms of shadow apps, full discovery of every AI native and every AI augmented app in use across the enterprise. Full accountability for those shadow tenants. We can see for all approved and unapproved apps, are we using personal or corporate accounts? Can we block users from logging in with their personal accounts? Yes. Can we start to implement some data controls? Also, yes. For shadow extensions, again, across all browsers, enumerate all of the browser extensions, their permissions, their function, how they were installed. With push, you can also block known bad extensions automatically. So we don't even have to do the legwork of performing some of that analysis in those cases. And then finally on shadow integrations, those OAuth and MCP connections, we start getting visibility into those, restricting where necessary. So we can start to implement really fine-grained, low friction, paved path controls for all of these use cases. So here are some of the capabilities doing the work that I talked about. You can see here some screenshots of Push Security's application inventory, as well as details and metadata for installed extensions. So in addition to getting that full visibility, you can start to audit some of the access and some of the capabilities and features in these apps, in these extensions, so you can make informed decisions before you start to apply policy. That's how we start to close this gap. Another favorite feature of mine in Push are app banners. So one thing that I really try to avoid as a former CTO and former security leader myself is I don't like to sell teams work. So if I'm deploying something that is going to result in blocks or alerts, okay, I want to make sure that my users understand what's happening there, okay, and that they have a path to getting where they need to get, or at least they understand why they can't get to where they're trying to get to. So what app banners and push help us achieve are those, informative user guardrails to say, this particular app isn't approved for business use this other one instead, or you can access this app, but you have to go set up MFA first, or you can access this app, you have to submit a justification request, or you have to read the policy and then you can click through and proceed. So not only does this provide enforceable, transparent controls, really cuts down the workload on your security team and your service desk when you can keep users informed as to the policies you're enforcing around their access. We can also kind of use this same banner or user notification functionality, since we're sitting in the browser, to let users know, hey, you're trying to connect this AI agent to something that you're not authorized to connect it to. If you need it for work, let us know. We'll review the request. But again, you intercept those connections at the moment the user initiates them. You let them know why, and you perhaps give them a path to, achieving whatever work-related goal they're trying to achieve, or finding another solution. If you want to see what this actually looks like in your environment, I highly recommend that you do, because the numbers are always a surprise. And you can do a free 30-day trial of Push Security. You can sign up for that by going to pushsecurity.com/shadow AI. Again, that's pushsecurity.com/shadow AI. You'll get a real picture of your AI, shadow AI attack surface within a day of deployment. I promise you will find things that you did not know were there. And that's all I've got. Quick recap: separate the noise from what you actually control, understand those 4 categories of shadow AI threats or use cases, make the govern path easier than the workaround, and get visibility before you try to enforce anything. Thank you very much for listening. And with that, I would love to take your questions.
So, hey, Dan.
Hey, thanks very much, Mark. Appreciate it. That was great. So yes, we've had quite a few questions come in. So we can start working through some of those now. But if there's any that grab your attention as well, just throw them out there and we can answer them. So I think a good place to start is on shadow extensions. How do you handle the gray area between scammy but not malicious and something that's actively dangerous? Where do we draw the line?
Yeah, great question. And from my perspective, it's best not to judge intent. We judge, capability, permissions, destination. And I would say it's important to kind of come up with your criteria for what constitutes an extension that you want in your environment versus an extension you do not want, and then take action accordingly. If you don't, you're basically, deferring incident response to potentially a later time. So I think it's helpful just to have a standard around, what permissions does an extension actually hold? If it's offloading data, where does that data go? And is the publisher reputable and verifiable? And if you don't have satisfactory answers to those, I would say get it out of there. Not worth trying to guess whether or not the extension will become malicious at some point in the future. So I think, absent any hard line between what constitutes scammy versus actively malicious, I think it's more important just to draw some line yourself based on that criteria and take action accordingly.
Excellent, great. Next question. JP has put quite a few questions in the chat here. I think I'll try and summarize a couple of them. So I guess the thrust of 2 of his questions there is around separating sort of read-only from write scopes within the integrations that are being made, and like what an agent or a user is authorizing an app to do. I guess whether we have that granularity versus the value of that granularity is maybe something you can talk to.
Yeah, JP, I liked your questions. And I would, it seems like the kind of common thread with some of the stuff you asked was around getting into like specific risk within each of the 4 categories that we defined: shadow apps, shadow tenants, shadow extensions, and shadow integrations. And as you, I think, rightfully pointed out, within some of these categories, like shadow integrations for OAuth connections, like what are the specific OAuth scopes? Because that changes the calculus of the controls you would have put in place and the risk associated. And I would say that the same is true with browser extensions. The same is true with shadow apps. And so I think probably first off, I would clarify that the 4 categories that we talked about, that's more of a mental model to sort of break down this big complex problem of shadow AI into kind of more cohesive categories and then proceed from there. It's not really intended as a threat model where you would get down into specific risks, threats, likelihood, impact, those kinds of things. So I think you make a good point here. Even if you're applying this model that we talked about, you would still need to dig into, for each of these categories, the specific threats and how you're responding to them and how you're managing them. And I think from our perspective, having a security agent sitting in the browser, that's a great control point to address all 4 of these, which is why we've kind of laid these out accordingly. But how you configure policies and what you do about various things within the categories, obviously there's going to be a lot of nuance there. It's going to change.
I think there's a follow-up question on sort of the quantification of blast radius, and I don't think that's something that we apply a hard number to. I think generally we avoid that in the platform, don't we? But I think certainly the severity of risk associated with the scopes and the number of integrations and those sort of things across those different categories is visible within the platform, I believe.
Right. Yeah, I mean, we're big on ground truth. So I think that's one advantage, again, of being right there in the browser, is you can map out those kind of OAuth connections, and you can see very, very quickly if you have an issue, if you have an incident, you can scope that incident very fast. Whereas I think in a lot of cases, if you don't have that visibility, identifying what those connections are can sometimes be a challenge. And so if you're trying to quantify exposure, obviously step 1 there is visibility. If you don't have the visibility, then you're left to kind of infer and guess and make assumptions. Obviously, that's not where we want to be. So I think that step 1, getting ground truth and gathering evidence, is definitely something that we help with and something that can be done in the product.
Great. There's a couple of questions here about how we compare with specific solutions. I think maybe it would be good to just talk a little bit about like how often you get in sort of network or endpoint layer visibility and how that's different to the sort of browser layer visibility that we provide.
Sure. Yeah, there was a question about dark trace. I think I saw in there, and Dan, I think you had a really good answer for that. I would agree with what you said. But kind of to your larger question, I think comparing something like Push Security, where we're operating inside the browser, to any other product that is more network oriented or endpoint oriented, I think we would be more complementary than competitive with a lot of those other tools. I think the big difference, especially where something like Shadow AI is concerned, is that if you are on the network and you're gathering network telemetry and you're dumping that into a repository and you're trying to do analytics for all of that, same thing with endpoint. To some extent, you are making inferences about what's happening, what's being shared. And I think that's one area where, to compare us against something like the Darktrace AI product, a lot of that signal is going to come from network data. So kind of getting back to that ground truth versus inference, I think if you're relying on network, not necessarily a bad approach, but we're going to have much more concrete evidence sitting in the browser for a lot of the things we're talking about, like OAuth grants, than you would get from the network side. So again, not to say that being in the browser and being on the network or endpoint is mutually exclusive. It's not. I think it's more complementary. But I think that's the big difference, is kind of inference versus being in the browser watching this stuff.
Yeah, I suppose it's one of the things that we, I guess the majority of the average users using these kind of apps, that activity is happening in the browser as opposed to anywhere else. Most users are not deploying like complex agentic environments and things like that. They are uploading files to LLMs through the browser, that sort of thing. And that's one, the activity that attackers are abusing in terms of the traps that are laying on the internet, and then the risk of, users sort of not acting in compliance with your policies and how you would like them to use those apps
Right.
inside the browser.
And there was, let's see, Dan, I don't know if you wanted to answer this one about desktop versions and lack of control, the question that just popped up. Is it fair to say that when an agent goes out to the web via browser, that push security is able to work its magic? I would say the answer is yes. Obviously, when you have a kind of thick client on the desktop, it's a little bit of a different situation than somebody doing something within the browser. However, one of the control points there is if you are connecting that app to other parts of your infrastructure, like M365 or Google Drive or anything else, that again is an OAuth consent that you're doing in the browser. So even if you've got kind of those thick clients, you can still kind of use the browser as a control point for those shadow integrations that we talked about.
Yeah, I suppose you could also say that a lot of these thick clients also have like a browser extension add-on, which is partly how they browse the web. It's not always. I mean, there are the sort of network layer queries that they can do as well, but often they will read a page and then you can see that like Claude in Chrome, for example, does this, where it'll like literally open the page and read it in front of you. Like that is happening in full view in the browser, so it's visible. But yeah, most users are not using thick clients compared to those that are just logging in the browser. Cool, good stuff. Can you see any other questions there that we haven't covered?
No, I think we've hit all of the ones that I saw. Louis, we certainly saw your comments. Someone will be reaching back out to you. And I would say to the larger group, as I said in the session here, please feel free to reach out. Ask about that free 30-day trial. We love to show off the product. We'd love to show you how some of this actually works. So yeah, don't hesitate to reach out. I'd like to hear from you.
Great. All right. Thanks very much, everyone. Cheers. See you next time.
Thanks all.